Welcome to Stitchers Collective. I'm Ramona Baird, and what we're going to be working on today is patriotic napkins. The emphasis for this session is on mitered corners. I'll show you a couple little tips and tricks, and your mitered corners will be beautiful. The materials that you will need are some fat quarters, as I purchased here. These are 100% cotton, or if you have some patriotic themed fabrics in your stash, go ahead and pull those out. The amount will be determined by the size of napkins that you will be making. You'll need some base fabric, which will be the back and the borders, and some embroidery thread in colors to match those themed fabric. Before doing anything, I like to go ahead and use some spray starch, open up the fabric, spray all of the fabrics really well, let them set while I get the iron set up and the machines, get the thread ready, my cutting tools, all of that kind of stuff. And what that does is allows the starch to penetrate into the fibers of the fabric. And I think if you start doing this, you will notice that your fabric actually gets crisper. Also, this faultless finished spray starch that I have here leaves no white flakes. And if you use 2 or 3 sprays of it with ironing in between, you'll get a nice crisp fabric. And of course, if you feel it necessary, pre-wash your fabrics. Choose patriotic fabrics for the center. These are going to be 4th of July napkins, but also think ahead. You can use this same construction method with the mitered corners and choose different theme fabrics, like for summertime, fall, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthdays with balloon fabric, all kinds of different ideas there. Make sure that you choose a background fabric that will be compatible and coordinate with the themed fabric that you have for the center of your napkins. For this project, I used 1/2 inch seam allowances. I've done this before where I've used 1/4 inch seam allowances, but I like that extra little bit of fabric all the way around on all edges. So again, 1/2 inch seam allowances, and there will be 1/2 inch seam allowances for the center theme fabric as well as for the border fabric. Cut the center themed fabric 9.5 inches square. And I used fat quarters for this, so it really didn't allow a lot of fabric at the edges. If you have something in your stash or you're purchasing fabric, make sure you have a little extra fabric. This was cutting it very, very close. You can either cut them individually as 9.5 inch squares, or you can fold and cut, or do as I did and quarter folded the fabric, laid the gridded ruler at the 9.5 inch mark, both horizontally and vertically, and then use the rotary cutter to cut along the edges. Then I opened up the fabric, and where I had creased in the folds well with my iron, then I just opened up the fabric and cut along those edges. Cut as many of the 9.5 inch square themed fabrics as you need for the amount of napkins. They can all match, or they can be all different like I've done here. For these napkins, I cut the base fabric so that there would be 1.5 inch borders all the way around and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if you're doing different size napkins, determine the width that you want each border. When calculating the size to cut that base fabric, not only do you have to add in the seam allowance and border depth on the front, but also the border depth on the back as well as the center area. So in calculating how much fabric I needed for each of these napkins, so here's the calculations. The center area is 9. The back border has 3 1/2 1/2. The front borders are 3 1/2 1/2 together is 3. The seam allowance is 1/2 inch for this side, 1/2 inch for this side is 1. So we cut the base fabric 16 inches square. After you cut your 16 inch squares of fabric for the base, cut as many as you need, of course, for the amount of napkins you will be doing. Next will be to mark 1/2 inch seam allowances all the way around. After all the sides are marked with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, the seam allowance will be folded back and press. Just crease the entire length of the seam allowance, and with your iron and maybe a little steam, go ahead and press. Press all of the seam allowances toward the inside, and next will be to press the borders. Take the fabric back over so that you'll be able to mark the 1.5 inch borders. Just lay the ruler along the fold of the seam allowance and mark a 1.5 inch border all the way around. At the ironing board, fold back along the line that was marked and use your finger, a wood presser or bone folder if you have one, to crease along that line and then press. Go ahead and do that for all 4 sides of the napkin. At this point, I just like to check and make sure everything is accurate. So I go ahead and lay that center themed fabric inside all of the borders and just make sure everything fits together well. I do this so that if there's any adjustments needed, now's the time to do them. Next will be to miter the corners, and here's where I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks that are going to make mitering very precise. We'll begin with the bottom border, and a pin will be placed in the border right at the fold position of the top border. For the top border, a pin will be aligned to the fold of the bottom border and a pin placed in the top border. I've done it both ways, beginning at the top and the bottom, and I actually find that beginning at the bottom is the easiest because then I'm not trying to get around the top pin. So make sure your corner fold is very neat. Align a pin along the fold line of the top border fold and place it right there into the fold of the bottom border. Then for the top border, place a pin along the bottom border fold and into the fold of the top border. So you'll have the pins intersecting right at that corner. And of course repeat for the remaining corners. Just follow those same steps. To do the miter, open up the corners and bring the pins together. So basically you're bringing the wrong side or the back side of the fabric together. Bring the pins together, form out the corner, and then lay it on a flat surface, meeting the folded edges of the adjacent sides together. There'll be a nice corner point and there will be a fold at a 45-degree angle. Next will be to sew from the fold to the corner, but first we're going to mark it. Take your ruler, lay one of the lines of the ruler, doesn't matter which one, along the fold, and make sure that the side of the ruler is aligning the pin and that corner point. And then use your pen or marking tool to draw that line. Once the line is drawn, you can add another pin up in that corner if you need to, or if you feel that you need to hold those edges together better. Repeat bringing the pins together, making sure everything is nice and straight, aligning the ruler, and then marking all of the lines for sewing. I like a 2.5 millimeter stitch length for this step, so bring the fabric under the presser foot, and I like to start forward of the fold 2 or 3 stitches. Sink the needle in, back stitch, stitch forward, ending at the corner, and then back stitching. And repeat for the remaining corners. If you know how to chain stitch, this is a good time to do it. All you're doing really is feeding one corner after the other right under the presser foot, and then trimming the little thread tails when you're finished. This really does save a little bit of time, especially when you're doing several napkins. Before doing any trimming to reduce the bulk in the seam, I like to bring the corner together so there'll be like a little square here. Use my thumb, flip it out, and just check to make sure that that corner is going to be pointed and that those borders are going to be even. And then I trim to reduce the bulk. Fold the fabric back to expose the seam allowance, trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch, and then cut off that little triangle at the fold to further reduce the bulk. Next will be to press. So open up the seam with your fingers, hold it with your thumb, and then if you have one, use a point presser to press this little seam. Place the corner or the seam over that point, and then just hit it with your iron and a little bit of steam. And again, if you have one, use a clapper to help further set that seam and make it nice and crisp. Then it's time to turn the corner. Stick your thumb as far as you can up toward that corner, flip the fabric over your thumb, and then use a point turner to form out that corner well. And then before pressing, make sure that corner is nice and sharp and the border is even. And then go ahead and press. This is a good time too to use a clapper, and you will see that you will get a really nice sharp corner and really flat borders. Once the first corner is done, then go ahead, repeat the process of trimming, pressing for all the remaining corners. At this point, I like to give the fabric another good starch. The other thing I like to do is check each corner. So I just fold it one way and check to make sure the corners are even, then open it up, fold it the other way, and make sure the corners are even there. Now we're almost done. All we have to do is insert the theme fabric and do our decorative stitching. So grab one layer of the theme fabric, open up the borders, and then just tuck that theme fabric into the border. To aid in centering that theme fabric, make sure that the cut edge of the fabric matches the cut edge of the seam allowance on each of the sides. Just like we used in the last session with the invisible zippers, this is the time I like to also use this Roxanne's Glue Based It. Wonderful product. A little goes a long way. Just place some dots or a very thin line, press the fabric in place, and then hit it with a dry iron. This product basically dries instantly. The first time the napkin is washed, the glue will disappear in the wash. And then of course just repeat for all the remaining sides. The glue will temporarily hold the fabrics together in place, and if you try and lift it, it actually is quite secure for such a little amount of glue. Now decide on the embroidery thread colors. I chose this royal blue, and I chose this triple stitch, which on this little Foff passport is a number 2. I also lengthened the stitch to a 3.0 millimeter. Begin right in one of the mitered corners, and you will be stitching all the way around the napkin to secure all of the layers of fabric in place. And I used this wider presser foot, and there's 2 marks on the presser foot, and the one that's red on the left I guided right along the folded edge of the border. After I'd gone all the way around the napkin, then instead of back stitching, I brought the tail ends to the back side, tied them, and then trimmed. Now it's time to do the second row of stitching. For this one I chose the gold thread, and you can choose to either wind a bobbin in the same color as the decorative thread, or you can use the white or whatever color matches the fabric that you're using as your base fabric. And on this machine the stars were a number 58, and hopefully you will have some sort of decorative stitch on your machine that will coordinate with the fabric that you're using. Begin again at a corner, use the left edge of the presser foot, guide it along the last row of stitching, and stitch the decorative stitch that you've chosen. When you're doing decorative stitches, don't go real fast. Allow the time for the machine to actually form those stitches so that you have sharp points and even stitching. Stitch around all the sides, leave yourself long tails, pull them to the back, and tie them off. Okay, so those are the basic steps, and that goes along with the PDF that is in the resource or download on demand area right above where the video is stored. So now let's watch in real time how this is done. Choose the fabrics that you're going to be using. You want some nice theme fabrics that will be cut 9.5 inches square. This set came as a fat quarter set, so I had a nice selection, and for the demonstration I will be using this one. You can alter the dimensions of the fabric for the size of napkins that you would like to create. For this one we are using a themed fabric cut at 9.5 inches square, which allows for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then the base fabric, which is the white Kona cotton, will have 1.5 inch borders all the way around, and you'll measure 1.5 on the back, plus the center portion as well. To begin, I like to go ahead and open up all the fabrics and spray them well with the spray starch. I let that spray starch rest while I go ahead and heat up the iron, set up the machine, wind the bobbins, gather all my tools, and you'll find that the product soaks into the fabric while creating a nice crisp fabric when you go to press it. I do like this faultless. So after everything's set up and the fabric has had time to soak in that spray starch, then go ahead and press all of the fabrics. This is 100% cotton fabric, so it presses very well. Next will be to go ahead and cut all of the fabrics, and you'll be cutting the fabric 9.5 inches wide for the center portion, and then allowing 1.5 inch borders all the way around. Cut as many as you need for the amount of napkins that you'll be doing. Be sure whatever fabric you're cutting in whatever size that you are allowing seam allowances. Again, for this one we're doing 1/2 inch seam allowances. There will be 1.5 inch seam allowances for the borders, and you can vary that too if you'd like. Decide how you're going to cut your pieces. Are you going to cut single layers of the fabric? Are you going to fold it over and do a double layer? And then use a gridded ruler to measure and mark. And remember, these fat quarters have very little at the top and on the sides. Get extra if you can. Or you can do as I did and quarter fold the fabric and press increases at the folds. Then I used my gridded ruler, laid the 9.5 inch marks right along the folds of the fabric. And then I'll use my rotary cutter to trim off the edges. Just go right up along those edges and trim off. Next will be to cut the 16-inch squares. Cut the 16-inch squares. And to check to make sure that they are square, I like to join opposite corners and then meet up the cut edges. If they meet, then I know that the piece is square. Open up the fabric. And now will be to measure and mark 1/2-inch seam allowances. I'm going to do that for all of the edges. I like to use a friction pen. I know a lot of people don't like it, but it shows up well for the videos. And I've never had a problem with it reappearing after I have washed and dried the fabrics. My favorite method though is to use a gridded ruler. Align the cut edge of the fabric along the 1/2-inch mark on the ruler and then just draw the lines. Just move the ruler as you need to and draw in those lines. And you'll be doing that on all sides of the napkin. Hold the ruler firmly and draw. Be very precise in marking. Okay, now you've got all 4 sides marked with a 1/2-inch seam allowance, so it's time to go to the ironing board for pressing. At the ironing board, you're going to take and fold back along the mark that you created. Flip the fabric over, fold back along that line, and I like to finger press. And because I've used spray starch, it really creases quite easily. Also, you can use a bone folder or wooden pressing tool if you have them. I think doing this step first makes pressing even easier. Even though I've got that bone folder, I actually like using my nails. I also like using that wool pad because the fabric kind of sinks in and helps crease the fabric easily. So just run my nail along the edge, and already you can see it's pretty crisp. And then take the iron and press the crease in well. See, you get a nice sharp edge. Do that all around the 4 edges. Once the 4 edges are done, then it will be time to fold back the fabric and mark the borders. So after the marking is done, then again, just come back, fold in the crease, and press. Fold up along the 1.5-inch fold line and press. And you don't have to do the pre-creasing with your nail if you don't want to, just go ahead and press. Try and be very exacting when you're doing this step. And now all 4 edges are creased. At this point, I actually like to check and make sure everything's going to fit together well and is like it should be, because if there's any changes to be made, this is the time to do it. So I just tuck in the edges of the center part of the fabric underneath the folded edges and make sure everything's going to fit nicely. And now we'll be able to start pinning for the miters. And we will be pinning that miter in by aligning pins. So we're going to align a pin along that edge and along that top edge. So grab your pins And again, I like to start with the bottom. Place the pin right at the fold. I'm tucking in that under edge. So I'm going to place a pin right in the bottom border along that top fold. So into the bottom border, right along that top fold. And then do just the opposite the other way. So I will be aligning to the bottom fold and placing it in the top border. And I'm just trying to catch a thread or two. And then I'll go along and do that for all 4 corners. Align the top fold and put a pin in the bottom. Align the bottom fold, put a pin in the top border. This goes pretty fast once you get the hang of it. Try and keep those corners nice and square. Bottom border aligned with the top fold. And top border aligned with the bottom fold. When I'm doing these, if I have a half a dozen or a dozen napkins, I do this all at once. So all of the napkins are done the same way. Now to form the miter. We'll take those pins, open up the napkin, and actually the bottom of the napkin is facing up. We'll bring the pins together, hold them firmly, make sure they're aligned. And at this point, I just take one pin and put it through all the layers and then remove the other pin. And then take the adjoining sides and make sure everything is aligned properly. Make sure those folds are even, the point is even, and there's no tucks of fabric underneath. We are going to be marking and sewing from the fold to the point. So make sure all the fabric is smooth. Sometimes fabric gets tucked up under there. You should have a 45-degree angle. Then lay your ruler, it doesn't matter which line you use, lay the straight line against that 45-degree fold and align the edge of the ruler to the point and the pins, and then draw a line. And that will be your stitching line. And repeat for all of the corners. And if you need to, put an extra pin in that corner to just keep things all together neatly. And then we can go to the machine and stitch. We're going to stitch from the fold to the corner. All right, at the machine, 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Hold on to those thread tails. And I like to start into the drawing or the seam line just a few stitches. Sink the needle. Lower the presser foot, back stitch just a few stitches right to the edge of the fold, and then stitch forward, stitching right to that point, sewing right along that drawn line. At the point, back stitch again. Raise the needle, lift the presser foot, and trim the thread tails. Now when we went through the step outs, I was saying that you could do chain stitching. So this is how we do it. Basically the same steps except feeding one corner right after the other. Grab those thread tails, lift the presser foot, begin again. Back stitch to the fold, stitch forward along the drawn line to the corner, back stitch. Now sink the needle so the fabric stays in place. Grab another corner, make sure you've got the folded edge, and remove the pin and just feed it right under the presser foot. Then in the end, all you'll have to do is trim those little thread tails between the corners. Just keep feeding them straight through. And if you have several napkins, just continue on until all of the napkins are done. Before doing any trimming, I like to go ahead and check to make sure that my corner is going to be crisp and the borders are going to be even. So I just open up that corner and it folds. If I match the points, folds into a little square, stick my thumb in there, pop that corner out just to kind of check it real quickly. Yeah, it's going to be fine. So now I turn it back out. Make sure you're only dealing with the seam allowance and the rest of the fabric is out of the way. Take your scissors and trim the seam to about 1/4 of an inch, and then trim off that little corner just to further reduce some bulk. Set the stitches. Then if you have one, use a point presser. Place the seam over the point presser, open up the seam, and then hit it with an iron. If you have one, use a clapper to further help set that seam. It really does help to keep it nice and flat. Stick your thumb up as far as you can. And if you're using that point turner, what you'll be doing is aligning the straight edge of the point turner right to that corner point along the seam line. And you see that you get a nice corner by doing all these steps. And there's no bulk in that corner. Lay the fabric flat, lay the borders flat, and check, and then press the corner. And use the clapper to set the seam. And you'll see it's absolutely beautiful mitered corner. So all of the corners have been mitered. So grab that themed fabric, insert it underneath all of those borders, and check it. Make sure everything's nice and flat. And if you need to adjust, you can see there's a little red sticking out here on the left-hand side. You can just scoot the fabric over that's in the center so that those cut edges match. Now use the Roxanne's basting glue. It's called Roxanne's Glue Basted. And use dots or just use a very thin line. Doesn't take much of this product. And then smooth the fabric back into place. And if you do get a little bit on the outside, don't worry about it because it will wash away. And then set the glue with a dry iron. You can see it dries very quickly and the edges don't lift. And then just repeat for the remaining sides. Now it's time to do the decorative stitching. Use either white bobbin thread or you can use bobbin thread to match the thread that you've chosen. Set the machine up for the decorative stitch. We're doing a triple stitch here. When I begin, I sink the needle right into the miter. Lower the presser foot. Now what I'm doing is aligning to this, the folded edge of the border to the left red mark on the presser foot. So just keep adjusting until it's accurate. Adjust the stitch length and then just stitch. And take your time in doing this. If you've got an IDT or a walking foot, now's a good time to use it as well. Helps feed the fabric with all of these layers. And just keep guiding the edge of the fold right to that red mark on the presser foot. Now as I get to the corner, what I'm doing is watching the formation of the stitch. So it goes forward, backward, forward, forward, backward, forward. So when I get toward that miter, so that I've got stitches sunk right in the corner without any overstitching, here I walk using the hand wheel, back, forward, and then I want to make sure that the needle is going to sink right into that mitered seam. So I just lift the presser foot a little bit, adjust as I need to, and you can see it's just a tiny, tiny little bit. Sink the needle in and form one more group of stitches, raise the presser foot, pivot, and turn and start stitching the other direction. So in that miter there should be a nice corner group of stitching. At the end of the blue I would just trim the thread tails after pulling them to the back. Then I would load the machine with the next color, which was the gold. So I've got gold bobbin and gold on the top. Start at the miter. Make sure no fabric is caught underneath. And I'm using the left edge of the presser foot guided along the blue stitching line. And just sew down the side. Now as I get to this corner, it's a little bit harder because we're doing a decorative stitch, which is a star, and I don't know exactly where it's going to end up, but I can see that I've got enough stitches between the stars that I can sink the needle in right at that mitered corner and then use my presser foot and the hand wheel to kind of fudge things a little bit. And then continue on down the next side. And there you have it. You've got some nice patriotic napkins, and don't forget, you can use these techniques to create napkins for all sorts of occasions. Just change out the background fabric, coordinate with some themed fabric for the middle part, and these also make really nice housewarming gifts if you have somebody who is having a party, or maybe they've got a new home. So think of all kinds of uses for this. And also the miters that I did on this, I could use the same technique of matching the pins after folding and pressing, for instance, for the back of a skirt, like on a kick pleat. There's all kinds of uses for this. So I hope you'll give it a try. Next time on Stitchers Collective, which is June 23rd, 11:30 a.m. Mountain Time, Denver time. I hope you can join us. We are going to be doing flat felled seams. And if you read the last post on GroupWorks, you learned and got to see that there are many different machines that will do flat felled seams, only in factories they are actually called lapped seams. So if you haven't checked out GroupWorks and seen those videos, I suggest you check them out before the next Stitchers Collective. I really want to thank you for joining our Stitchers Collective. It's a lot of fun for me to put these together and present them, and especially because it's information that you want.